Welcome back, friends. I am loosely based on Roy Lichtenstein's 1963 picture Drowning Girl, and I'm here to read. So every week, first we read a piece of classic literature together, and then we talk about it. If you would like to follow along as we read aloud, down below in the video description box, there is a copy of a free ebook, and down there you will also find links to the author's biography, as well as some other source links. This week we are reading Lamb to the Slaughter by Roald Dahl. The room was warm and clean, the curtains drawn, the two table lamps alight, hers and the one by the empty chair opposite. On the sideboard behind her, two tall glasses, soda water, whiskey, fresh ice cubes in the thermos bucket. Mary Maloney was waiting for her husband to come home from work. Now and again she would glance up at the clock, but without anxiety, merely to please herself with the thought that each minute gone by made it nearer the time when he would come. There was a slow, smiling air about her, and about everything she did. The drop of a head as she bent over her sewing was curiously tranquil. Her skin, for this was her 6th month with child, had acquired a wonderful translucent quality. The mouth was soft, and the eyes, with their new placid look, seemed larger, darker than before. When the clock said 10 minutes to 5, she began to listen, and a few moments later, punctually as always, she heard the tires on the gravel outside, and the car door slamming, the footsteps passing the window, the key turning in the lock. She laid aside her sewing, stood up, and went forward to kiss him as he came in. "Hello, darling," she said. "Hello, darling," he answered. She took his coat and hung it in the closet. Then she walked over and made the drinks, a strongish one for him, a weak one for herself. And soon she was back again in her chair with the sewing, and he in the other, opposite, holding the tall glass with both hands, rocking it so the ice cubes tinkled against the side. For her, this was always a blissful time of day. She knew he didn't want to speak much until the first drink was finished, and she, on her side, was content to sit quietly, enjoying his company after the long hours alone in the house. She loved to luxuriate in the presence of this man, and to feel, almost as a sunbather feels the sun, that warm male glow that came out of him to her when they were alone together. She loved him for the way he sat loosely in a chair, for the way he came in a door, or moved slowly across the room with long strides. She loved the intent, far look in his eyes when they rested on her, the funny shape of his mouth, and especially the way he remained silent about his tiredness, sitting still with himself until the whiskey had taken some of it away. "Tired, darling?" "Yes," he said. "I'm tired." And as he spoke, he did an unusual thing. He lifted his glass and drained it in one swallow, although there was still half of it, at least half of it left. She wasn't really watching him, but she knew what he had done because she heard the ice cubes falling back against the bottom of the empty glass when he lowered his arm. He paused a moment, leaning forward in the chair. Then he got up and went slowly over to fetch himself another. "I'll get it," she cried, jumping up. "Sit down," he said. When he came back, she noticed that the new drink was dark amber with a quantity of whiskey in it. "Darling, shall I get your slippers?" No. She watched him as he began to sip the dark yellow drink, and she could see the little oily swirls in the liquid because it was so strong. I think it's a shame, she said, that when a policeman gets to be as senior as you, they keep him walking about on his feet all day long. He didn't answer, so she bent her head again and went on with her sewing. But each time he lifted the drink to his lips, she heard the ice cubes clinking against the side of the glass. Darling, she said, would you like me to get you some cheese? I haven't made any supper because it's Thursday. No, he said. If you're too tired to eat out, she went on, it's still not too late. There's plenty of meat and stuff in the freezer, and you can have it right here and not even move out of the chair. Her eyes waited on him for an answer, a smile, a little nod, but he made no sign. Anyway, she went on, I'll get you some cheese and crackers first. I don't want it, he said. She moved uneasily in her chair, the large eyes still watching his face. But you must eat. I'll fix it anyway, and then you can have it or not, as you like. She stood up and placed her sewing on the table by the lamp. Sit down, he said. Just for a minute. Sit down. It wasn't till then that she began to get frightened. Go on, he said. Sit down. She lowered herself back slowly into the chair, watching him all the time with those large, bewildered eyes. He had finished the second drink and was staring down into the glass, frowning. Listen, he said. I've got something to tell you. What is it, darling? What's the matter? He had now become absolutely motionless, and he kept his head down so that the light from the lamp beside him fell across the upper part of his face, leaving the chin and mouth in shadow. She noticed there was a little muscle moving near the corner of his left eye. This is going to be a bit of a shock to you, I'm afraid, he said. But I thought about it a good deal, and I've decided the only thing to do is to tell you right away. I hope you won't blame me too much. And he told her. It didn't take long, 4 or 5 minutes at most, and she sat very still through it all, watching him with a kind of dazed horror as he went further and further away from her with each word. So there it is, he added. And I know it's kind of a bad time to be telling you, but there simply wasn't any other way. Of course, I'll give you money and see you're looked after, but there needn't really be any fuss. I hope not, anyway. Wouldn't be very good for my job. Her first instinct was not to believe any of it, to reject it all. It occurred to her that perhaps he hadn't even spoken, that she herself had imagined the whole thing. Maybe if she went about her business and acted as though she hadn't been listening, then later when she sort of woke up again, she might find none of it had ever happened. I'll get the supper, she whispered, and this time he didn't stop her. When she walked across the room, she couldn't feel her feet touching the floor. She couldn't feel anything at all, except a slight nausea and a desire to vomit. Everything was automatic now. Down the steps to the cellar, light switch, a deep freeze, the hand inside the cabinet taking hold of the first object it met. She lifted it out, looked at it. It was wrapped in paper, so she took off the paper and looked at it again. A leg of lamb. All right, then, they would have lamb for supper. She carried it upstairs, holding the thin bone end of it with both her hands. And as she went through the living room, she saw him standing over by the window with his back to her, and she stopped. "For God's sake," he said, hearing her but not turning round. "Don't make supper for me. I'm going out." At that point, Mary Maloney simply walked up behind him, and without any pause, she swung the big frozen leg of lamb high in the air and brought it down as hard as she could on the back of his head. She might just as well have hit him with a steel club. She stepped back a pace, waiting, and the funny thing was that he remained standing there for at least 4 or 5 seconds, gently swaying. Then he crashed to the carpet. The violence of the crash, the noise, the small table overturning helped bring her out of the shock. She came out slowly, feeling cold and surprised, and she stood for a while, blinking at the body, still holding the ridiculous piece of meat tight with both hands. "All right," she told herself. "So I've killed him." It was extraordinary, now, how clear her mind became all of a sudden. She began thinking very fast. As the wife of a detective, she knew quite well what the penalty would be. That was fine. It made no difference to her. In fact, it would be a relief. On the other hand, what about the child? Were there the laws about murderers and unborn children? Did they kill them both, mother and child? Did they wait until the 10th month? What did they do? Mary Maloney didn't know. And she certainly wasn't prepared to take a chance. She carried the meat into the kitchen, placed it in a pan, turned the oven on high, and shoved it inside. Then she washed her hands and ran upstairs to the bedroom. She sat down before the mirror, tidied her hair, touched up her lips and face. She tried a smile. It came out rather peculiar. She tried again. "Hello, Sam," she said, brightly, aloud. The voice sounded peculiar, too. "I want some potatoes, please, Sam. Yes, and I think a can of peas." That was better. Both the smile and the voice were coming out better now. She rehearsed it several times more. Then she ran downstairs, took her coat, went out the back door, down the garden, into the street. It wasn't 6 o'clock yet, and the lights were still on in the grocery shop. "Hello, Sam," she said, brightly, smiling at the man behind the counter. "Why, good evening, Mrs. Maloney. How are you?" "I want some potatoes, please, Sam. Yes, and I think a can of peas." The man turned and reached up behind him on the shelf for peas. "Patrick's decided he's tired and doesn't want to go out to eat tonight," she told him. "We usually go out Thursdays, you know, and now he's caught me without any vegetables in the house." "Then how about meat, Mrs. Maloney?" "No, I've got meat, thanks. I've got a nice leg of lamb from the freezer." "Oh." "I don't know how much I like cooking it frozen, Sam, but I'm taking a chance on it this time. Do you think it'll be all right?" "Personally," the grocer said, "I don't believe it makes any difference. You want these Idaho potatoes?" "Oh, yes, that'll be fine. 2 of those." "Anything else?" The grocer cocked his head to one side, looking at her pleasantly. "How about afterwards? What are you going to give him for afterwards?" "Well, what would you suggest, Sam?" The man glanced around his shop. "How about a nice big slice of cheesecake? I know he likes that." "Oh, perfect," she said. "He loves it." And when it was all wrapped and she had paid, she put on her brightest smile and said, "Thank you, Sam. Good night." "Good night, Mrs. Maloney, and thank you." And now, she told herself, as she hurried back, all she was doing now, she was returning home to her husband, and he was waiting for his supper, and she must cook it good and make it as tasty as possible, because the poor man was tired, and if, when she entered the house, or happened to find anything unusual, or tragic, or terrible, then naturally it would be a shock, and she'd become frantic with grief and horror. Mind you, she wasn't expecting to find anything. She was just going home with the vegetables. Mrs. Patrick Maloney going home with the vegetables on Thursday evening to cook supper for her husband. That's the way, she told herself. Do everything right and natural. Keep things absolutely natural, and there will be no need for any acting at all. Therefore, when she entered the kitchen by the back door, she was humming a little tune to herself and smiling. "Patrick," she called, "how are you, darling?" She put the parcel down on the table and went into the living room. And when she saw him lying there on the floor with his legs doubled up and one arm twisted back underneath his body, it really was rather a shock. All the old love and longing for him welled up inside her, and she ran over to him, knelt down beside him, and began to cry her heart out. It was easy. No acting was necessary. A few minutes later, she got up and went to the phone. She knew the number of the police station, and when the man at the other end answered, she cried to him, "Quick, come quick, Patrick's dead!" "Who's speaking?" "Mrs. Maloney, Mrs. Patrick Maloney." "You mean Patrick Maloney's dead?" "I think so," she sobbed. "He's lying on the floor, and I think he's dead." "Be right over," the man said. The car came very quickly, and when she opened the front door, 2 policemen walked in. She knew them both. She knew nearly all the men at that precinct, and she fell right into a chair, then went over to join the other one, who was called O'Malley, kneeling by the body. "Is he dead?" she cried. "I'm afraid he is. What happened?" Briefly, she told her story about going out to the grocer and coming back to find him on the floor. While she was talking, crying and talking, Noonan discovered a small patch of congealed blood on the dead man's head. He showed it to O'Malley, who got up at once and hurried to the phone. Soon other men began to come in the house. First a doctor, then 2 detectives, one of whom she knew by name. Later, a police photographer arrived and took pictures, and a man who knew about fingerprints. There was a great deal of whispering and muttering beside the corpse, and the detectives kept asking her a lot of questions. But they always treated her kindly. She told her story again, this time right from the beginning when Patrick had come in, and she was sewing, and he was tired, so tired he hadn't wanted to go out for supper. She told how she put the meat in the oven. It's there now, cooking. And how she'd stepped out to the grocer for vegetables and come back to find him lying on the floor. "Which grocer?" one of the detectives asked. She told him, and he turned and whispered something to the other detective, who immediately went outside into the street. 15 minutes, he was back with a page of notes, and there was more whispering, and through her sobbing she heard quite a few of the whispered phrases. Acted quite normal. Very cheerful. Wanted to give him a good supper. Peas, cheesecake. Impossible that she... After a while, the photographer and the doctor departed, and 2 other men came in and took the corpse away on a stretcher. Then the fingerprint man went away. The 2 detectives remained, and so did the 2 policemen. They were exceptionally nice to her, and Jack Noonan asked if she wouldn't rather go somewhere else, to her sister's house perhaps, or to his own wife who would take care of her and put her up for the night. No, she said. She didn't feel as if she could move even a yard at the moment. Would they mind awfully if she just stayed right where she was until she felt better? She didn't feel too good at the moment. She really didn't. Then hadn't she better lie down on the bed? Jack Noonan asked. No, she said. She'd like to stay right where she was in this chair. A little later, perhaps, when she felt better, she would move. So they left her there while they went about their business searching the house. Occasionally, one of the detectives asked her another question. Sometimes Jack Noonan spoke at her gently as he passed by. Her husband, he told her, had been killed by a blow on the back of the head administered with a heavy, blunt instrument, almost certainly a large piece of metal. They were looking for the weapon. The murderer may have taken it with him, but on the other hand, he may have thrown it away or hidden it somewhere on the premises. It's the old story, he said. Get the weapon, you've got the man. Later, one of the detectives came up and sat beside her. Did she know, he asked, of anything in the house that could have been used as the weapon? Would she mind having a look around to see if anything was missing? A very big spanner, for example, or a heavy metal vase? They didn't have any heavy metal vases, she said. Or a big spanner? She didn't think they had a big spanner, but there might be some things like that in the garage. The search went on. She knew that there were other policemen in the garden all around the house. She could hear their footsteps on the gravel outside, and sometimes she saw a flash of a torch through a gap in the curtains. It began to get late, nearly 9, she noticed by the clock on the mantel. The 4 men searching the rooms seemed to be growing weary, a trifle exasperated. Jack, she said, the next time Sergeant Noonan went by. Would you mind giving me a drink? Sure, I'll give you a drink. You mean this whiskey? Yes, please, but just a small one. It might make me feel better. He handed her the glass. Why don't you have one yourself? She said. You must be awfully tired. Please do. You've been very good to me. Well, he answered, it's not strictly allowed, but I might take just a drop to keep me going. One by one, the others came in and were persuaded to take a little nip of whiskey. They stood around rather awkwardly with the drinks in their hands, uncomfortable in her presence, trying to say the consoling things to her. Sergeant Noonan wandered into the kitchen, came out quickly, and said, Look, Mrs. Maloney, you know that oven of yours is still on, and the meat's still inside. Oh, dear me, she cried, so it is. I'd better turn it off for you, hadn't I? Will you do that, Shank? Thank you so much. When the sergeant returned the second time, she looked at him with her large, dark, tearful eyes. Jack Noonan, she said. Yes. Would you do me a small favor? You and these others? We can try, Mrs. Maloney. Well, she said, here you all are, and good friends of dear Patrick's, too, and helping to catch the man who killed him. You must be terribly hungry by now, because it's long past your supper time, and I know Patrick would never forgive me, God bless his soul, if I allowed you to remain in his house without offering you decent hospitality. Why don't you just eat up that lamb that's in the oven? It'll be cooked just right by now. I wouldn't dream of it, Sergeant Noonan said. Please, she begged. Please eat it. Personally, I couldn't touch a thing, certainly not what's been in the house when he was here. But it's all right for you. It'd be a favor to me if you'd eat it up. Then you can go on with your work again afterwards. There was a good deal of hesitating among the 4 policemen, but they were clearly hungry, and in the end they were persuaded to go into the kitchen and help themselves. The woman stayed where she was, listening to them speaking amongst themselves, their voices thick and sloppy because their mouths were full of meat. "Have some more, Charlie?" "Nah, better not finish it." "She wants us to finish it. She said so. Be doing her a favor." "Okay, then, give me some more." "That's one hell of a big club the guy must have used to hit poor Patrick," one of them was saying. "The doc says his skull was smashed all to pieces, just like from a sledgehammer." "That's why it ought to be easy to find." "Exactly what I say. Whoever done it, they're not going to be carrying a thing like that around with them longer than they need." One of them belched. "Personally, I think it's right here on the premises." "Probably right under our very noses. What do you think, Jack?" And in the other room, Mary Maloney began to giggle. The end. So we're doing a story with a female murderer that's kind of funny. So if I'm going as nothing else this Halloween, at least I'm going as on brand. Lamb to the Slaughter was initially published in Harper's Magazine in 1953, and then it was later published in one of Roald Dahl's short story compilations called Someone Like You. Apparently, the premise of it was suggested to him by Ian Fleming, who's the guy who wrote James Bond, but he was just kind of like, you know what would be funny if, like, and yes, it is supposed to be funny, is if this woman killed somebody by hitting them over the head with a piece of frozen meat. And Roald Dahl said, yes, that would be very funny. Let's make it a comedy. Roald Dahl is a very interesting writer because almost all of his writing is in some ways supposed to be funny, but with like a dark, weird twist to it. And for me, the premise is particularly brilliant because a lot of the times horror relies on the mystery of who the murderer is to do the heavy lifting. When we're in the murderer's shoes, it kind of adds like a fun little twist to it. It makes us empathize with the murderer in a way that we're not really generally intended to. Like usually the murderer is a monster who is doing murders and things like that. And here we have like, it's Mary Maloney. We don't want her to get caught. She's gonna hurt her baby, you guys. We don't want her to get caught. I hope they don't figure it out, right? And now that we're outside of it, it's like, wait a minute. Yes, we do. By that token, this whole story is just a study in irony. Irony is kind of the crossroads of what is expected and the reality of the situation. There are lots of different types, too. There's verbal irony, which is kind of like sarcasm, where, you know, somebody will trip and instead of another character saying, you know, hey, you tripped, you should be more careful, the character will say like, nice moves. Real slick there, buddy. That's verbal irony. And then that goes all the way into dramatic irony, which has the audience playing a role there, where the audience will have information that the characters within the work don't. So it's very much that like, oh my God, don't go in there, the murderer's in that closet kind of thing. A great example for me of irony is literally everything that happens in the first half of Titanic. There are some moments which are more ironic in that way than others, like when they talk about, oh, there aren't enough lifeboats to save everyone here, folks. Oh, it's okay though, because the Titanic is unsinkable.
Waste of deck space as it is in an unsinkable ship.
Like that is very, very ironic, but also just even like the party scenes and the dining room scenes, things like that, like us as the audience, we have it in the back of our heads that like, this is, you know, most of these people are gonna die. And within Lamb to the Slaughter, even though it's a very short piece, there are a bunch of different types of irony at hand. It starts off with what's called situational irony, where things just don't shake out the way that we would expect them to based on, you know, our worldview, based on the information that we have at hand early. At the beginning of the story, we have Mary Maloney, and she's pregnant, and she's so excited for her husband to come home, and oh my gosh, she has no idea that anything's about to happen to her. And then Patrick comes home and he dumps her immediately. And that one's funny because certain interpretations of this work, other than this one, assert that he's having an affair. And I think that we can kind of infer that, but maybe he's just sick of her, you know? They would not have recourse in 1953 if he was just like, I'm sick of you. This wig is terrible. So we wouldn't expect that from the dude who this woman is all, oh, we're gonna have a baby together. It's so nice, my loving husband. You wouldn't expect him to come home and do that. So that's one example of situational irony. And then the biggest example of situational irony is that Mary is built up as this frail, sweet little housewife who she's so nice and whatever. And then she hauls off and like clocks a dude with a huge piece of meat. You wouldn't expect the meat to be the murder weapon. You wouldn't expect sweet, kind, pregnant little Mary Maloney as a housewife to be a murderer. It's just all wrapped up in the situational irony. And then at that point, there's a slight twist to the story because we see our naivety projected back to us with the entire rest of the characters and how they perceive Mary Maloney. Now we are in on that information and we see how Mary Maloney manipulates the situation in order to throw the suspicion off of herself. All we have to do is find the murder weapon. Would you like a piece of lamb? And the lamb itself is kind of interesting in terms of like, what is the lamb and who is the lamb? Like, is the lamb to the slaughter Patrick, where he is literally slaughtered? Or is it Mary, who she's a sweet and innocent pregnant lady and she's coming to get her husband some food and then he's like, no, yeah, go away. Go away, Mary Maloney, we're getting a divorce. Like, is that the lamb to the slaughter? Or is it the innocence of the cops, who you wouldn't ordinarily say like, oh yes, the babe in the woods cops, you know? But because they are clueless about Mary, through the rest of the story, she kind of like pulls them along on this trek of like, oh, I'm bereaved and my husband is dead. And then she basically brings the hammer down and has them destroy the evidence. Like, that's their slaughter. Or is it the actual lamb? Like the leg of lamb? One thing that I find like weirdly refreshing about this story is that usually when you read a murder mystery, there's some kind of... The murderer always has an excuse, right? They're, oh, my upbringing, oh... I wouldn't have if only the person hadn't blah, blah, blah. And Mary's like, yeah, I killed them. Oops. Like, she clearly has a motivation or reason for having killed him, but she doesn't try to use that as a justification. You know what I mean? Like, she's just like, I killed him and now I better try and get away with murder or else I don't know what's going to happen to my baby. So it's so refreshing sometimes. So I hope that you enjoyed Lamb to the Slaughter. I hope my Halloween costume wasn't too distracting. So fun. I love this look. If you did like... I hate this wig though. If you did like the story, make sure to leave a thumbs up down below so that I know that you liked it. So maybe we'll read some more like this in the future. And I hope to see you next week for more classic literature.